especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in Quebec, there were a lot of newspapers that dealt with crime only. Crime, in a sense, has replaced adventure, has replaced all these old pre-20th century genres, stories of knighthood and chivalry and epic adventures. Crime, I think, is the thing that interests us almost more than anything else. First of all, in Quebec, there's a much richer, longer tradition of tabloid newspapers. Again, I think that's because, it's not because Quebecers are more sensational, it's just that Anglo-Canadians read the American ones. But you also, it contributes to this long-standing image of Montreal in particular as a kind of crime-ridden city. I don't want to get into the whole debate from Maclean's magazine and corruption, but I mean, there's been a long-standing public interest in crime in Montreal. It's been much more of a political issue for 50 or 60 years, and you've had tabloid magazines that picked up on that. And those are very interesting because, the Quiet Revolution in Quebec manifested itself at some level in political change, but it's also had a lot to do with changing morality, and tabloid newspapers kind of both contributed to changes of morality by opening up certain questions for public interest and discussion, and also just kind of reflected that. What we have less and less of are the kind of tabloid newspapers that we would have had 50 years ago that would have had a blaring headline and would have really exploited it. I think partly because newspapers, to survive now, they're going after a more, a more educated, professional kind of readership, and so they kind of pull back from that kind of sensationalist treatment. Well, I think especially tabloid newspapers are important if you want to know what people were thinking about, what concerned them, what excited them. Reading the Globe and Mail is not going to give you necessarily an accurate account of that. You read the Globe and Mail and you'll know that the Dion quintuplets were important in the 1930s. You read tabloid newspapers and you realize that people were obsessed with them throughout most of the 1930s. So you read the Montreal mainstream newspapers from the 1960s and you think it was all Expo 67 and scientific marvels, whereas if you read Allo Police, where they barely mention Expo 67, you'll realize it's Monique la Mitraillette, the machine gun Molly, and the kind of criminals who really were capturing public attention. All of these Canadian entrepreneurs emerged to produce Canadian versions of these. And so you have a very clear case of public policy shaping a cultural industry. They brought together all these interesting writers. Milton Cronenberg, David Cronenberg's father, wrote a whole bunch of true crime magazines. And so, I mean, these were important products of entrepreneurial spirit, of people who work in other media, moving and writing in these media, and so they're really part of a history of Canadian creativity. I mean, and by creativity I mean both in an entrepreneurial sense and in a kind of artistic sense. So why would we want to leave that out of our history of Canadian culture? I mean, the interesting thing about crime is that sociologists will say that crime is the genre of fiction and entertainment that is read almost equally by all classes of society, all levels of education. Your well-educated lawyer on holiday, she reads a crime novel, and then, working class people at lunch watch crime programs. So true crime is everywhere. So there are now kind of fancy versions of true crime. People who try and relate true crime to surrealism, people who try and set it within artistic traditions, but there's also the really tacky, lurid versions of true crime. I mean, it's everywhere, and the thing is, it operates at all kind of levels of taste, of levels of prestige, of levels of classiness, if you like. And that's the amazing thing about it, I think. A standard thing about people is they always think they live in a more violent period than everyone that came before, or that people now, we've never seen such degraded entertainment. Newspapers now are only interested in crime, as if before all they did was print parliamentary speeches for 11 pages. So I think studying the treatments of crime really helps us to see that actually in many ways we live in a fairly tame kind of period, at least in terms of how media try and excite us and exploit these things. So I would say that's the main thing.